Hello, welcome everyone. As this is the last session, well done for keeping with the program for this long. I'm impressed that this many people made it, to be honest. So well done to all of you. I'll try and keep this fairly light-hearted, but it's a DevOps kind of talk, so it's probably a bit dry in places. So please feel free to interrupt at any point, and feel free to ask me questions. I have slides here, but I'm also quite happy to answer questions as well. So as you think of things, or if you want me to clarify at any point, please feel free to interject. Let's kind of get a conversation going. So I'm Alex Bleasdale. I've worked for the support team since 2012, and I've been with MarkLogic for almost 7 years now. Started off in consulting, moved over to support. I now run the support team in Europe. So there's a few faces here that I recognize already from cases that I've worked on. So hello to all the customers who filed support cases with our team. Okay, just a bit of background. The US version of this slide had a quote from Einstein. I thought I'd change that and put in a quote by Donald Rumsfeld instead, because I figured that was even more appropriate from one master thinker to Donald Rumsfeld. Anyway, the quote, our task, your task, is to try to connect the dots before something happens. This, to me, is quite important because I think, ideally, the essence of this talk is about trying to figure out and preempt problems, and hopefully some of the techniques that you can use to stop them from becoming real problems. So if you like, it's setting yourself up to not fail, or if you do fail, you don't fail quite as badly as you would have done if you hadn't prepared at all, to quote Benjamin Franklin. So we're going to start off with our talk by looking at what artifacts you'll find in the ErrorLog as you're running a cluster. Some of the scenarios I'm going to be looking at here will be working through real customer scenarios. There are no names in here in most cases, but they're real situations that we've seen in support. We're going to look at some of the symptoms, what you can look for in the ErrorLog, so you can understand what to look out for. We've then got the problem. We'll describe and discuss the problem. We'll look at some of the causes and the steps that you can take to remediate. Okay, this is probably the most daunting slide in the deck. I'm going to touch upon a lot of these, but probably at a fairly sort of high level. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, but this kind of just gives you just a quick overview of all of the areas we'll touch upon as we start looking at some of these cases, and I'll expand out some of these concepts over the next few slides. So if you like, this is the set of core concepts that our scenarios, our support scenarios will cover. I just listed a large number of concepts here. I'd now like to plug two of these PDF documents. I've got to say that I think these two are vital reading for anyone who's looking after a live MarkLogic cluster, and I'd strongly recommend, if you take anything away from this session, that you remember to look at these. Inside MarkLogic Server, for those that haven't read it before, we're now in our 8th edition of it. It was originally written by Jason Hunter, and the recent edition has another co-author, Mike Waldridge, who's also part of the app services team as well, so he's quite close to the server. It's an excellent read. If you've read it a while back, but you haven't read it recently, I suggest you get the latest release because it's changed quite a bit. It's 127 pages, but it is very, very readable. The second one, and I think this is maybe the lesser known, is the Performance Understanding System Resources paper. It was published last year in December, and it's also available in PDF format. I'd strongly recommend you go and find that. It's in our media section under white papers. These two together give you a lot of really good background into the internals of how the server works. So that's learning the concepts. In addition to that, if you are dealing with MarkLogic Server and you are looking after a live cluster, I've also got to plug, rather shamelessly, MarkLogic University. In the time that I've been working at MarkLogic, what the university offers has really substantially improved and changed. And it's now got to the point where we offer developer and administrator training, online classes, and even on-demand training as well. So if you can sit in, take some time out of work and sit in on sessions, which take up pretty much the full day, then great. If not, maybe some of the on-demand classes will help. And then from there, obviously, you can go on to certification. We offer 2 tracks. There's the Certified Developer track and now the Certified Administrator as well. We also very recently, about a month ago I think, added the assessments in as well. So you can take some sort of micro exams, if you like, to test your readiness for any certification. Thank you so much for that. That's awesome. So yeah, assessment and certification, this is all fairly new to MarkLogic University. It certainly wasn't around when I first joined, and I think it's been under a lot of work over the last few years. So definitely a good place to start. Okay, so we have our fictional company in this case. They've bought some server licenses. They've hired someone who's just been certified. And over the next few slides, we're going to look at some of the scenarios they might encounter. So if you like, what follows is their story. However, as it's the end of the day, and probably some of you are getting a bit tired, I'm going to introduce a bit of interactivity now. And of course, because this is a support forum, I need to ask you a question about support. So who's viewed the contents of an ErrorLog file before? Brilliant. That's all of you. Why are you here? No. Okay, so yeah, right, great. So I was wondering if there was going to be a split there, but it looks like pretty much most of you are on top of this. So that's great. So what logs? Okay, in this case, it looks like you've all looked at them before. ErrorLog.txt is the main one that we'll probably be working with, and certainly throughout this case. It's going to contain output from the server itself. One of the engineering team actually described this as almost being like, if you imagine the server could tweet, these are the sorts of things it would be saying. They'd be written out as nuggets in the ErrorLog.txt. And we use these pretty much as our first port of call if we're trying to diagnose a problem with the server. What was it doing at the time? So ErrorLog.txt is always your first port of call. It contains MarkLogic server output, which isn't going to be the bulk of it, depending on what your application does and your developers do, because you can also log to it as well, using a call to XDMP-log. If you're a bit more fancy with your development work, you can also write your own custom trace events, and you can use XDMP trace and enable trace events that will also trace out to ErrorLog.txt. There are also access logs. One of the things that I should probably share with you now for access logs is they only log requests that finish. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to debug a problem where the server seg faults, for example, the MarkLogic process seg faults, you're not going to see anything in the access logs. They're just not going to help. So access logs will give you an idea of what the server was doing before something went wrong, but it may not give you they may not give you an indication of why there was a problem with the host at that point or the server process at that point. So access logs, they're obviously divided up by ports, so the more app servers you have on your cluster, the more of these log files you'll have. They're retained for 7 days by default. That can be changed if you ever need to. Defaults are pretty good. I mean, if you've missed a problem that happened 7 days ago, you probably weren't that interested anyway, one would imagine. Yeah, and obviously they're per host, so everything in MarkLogic is per host. Error logs, access logs, all deal with what's happening on the one host in the cluster. So remember that if you're trying to look at a problem, even if one of the hosts exhibits a problem, you might find that it's another host that was the cause of it. Okay, so again, as this is a support talk, one of the first things that we recommend you do, and I'd strongly recommend you do this, if not in production, certainly do this in development and any staging environments that aren't operation critical. Set your file logging to debug. This will give you a little bit more information than info. And note here, this is quite important, expect less than 1 message per second as a general rule anyway. So that should give you a pretty good indication if things are working well, that it's not going to have a serious overhead on performance. Having said that though, what MarkLogic, the product logs, and what people do as developers with the error logs are two very different things. So error logs can be made much larger if your developers are actually using them to log out, particularly large XML nodes, which is quite common. So yeah, log level to debug, and you should see less than 1 message per second if things are going well. If they're not, then you'll probably see quite a lot. And you know, there's a large range of things that you could be seeing there. Okay, probably the second most useful slide, I think. It's probably fairly obvious. If you are looking after and monitoring error logs, these are some of the things that I think are probably worth looking out for. On the left-hand side, hopefully it's pretty obvious. If you're seeing notice level messages, you're going to be seeing situations where things have changed. So a good example of when you'll see notice level messages from the server is when any of the configuration files change and they're written across the cluster. So notice level messages will give you a good indication as to whether something's changed and whether files have changed. Warning you'll see warning level, error, and critical level messages when there are big problems, and obviously, bigger problems and even bigger problems. So I would strongly recommend looking out for anything that says warning, error, or critical. In a lot of cases, it may just be that you've got an exception in your code, and it may not be a problem with the server, but even so, you might catch some bugs that way as well. Obviously, if you're using try and catches, log exceptions as well. For things like backup and replication, start and stop are in the logs for things like backup starting, replication starting and stopping, and so on. Then on the other side, I've broken these down into groups of messages. So you've got the service layer, which is, if you like, the kind of the TCP, the network layer, what's going on with the socket layer, really, MarkLogic, opening sockets, creating connections, and so on. One level above that, you've got XDMP. So these are kind of server-related operations. So refragmenting, off the top of my head, backup and restore. You may well see XDMP level log messages there. You may also see XDMP issues if you've got exceptions in Xquery code and so on. And finally, XDQP, which is the inter-host communication protocol that the hosts in the cluster use to talk to each other. So if you see XDQP level messages, you know there's probably a communication issue between hosts. Okay, so we've gone through quite a few different concepts and some things to look out for. We'll now start looking at some scenarios. This is only a sample of scenarios, but it will give you some idea of some of the things that we found to look at. So the first one is a popular class, which is XDMP-IN and then something full. Before I go into that, I'm just going to talk about some of the concepts behind this. Is everyone familiar with the difference between databases, forests, and stands here? So database is a large theoretical container, and it spans across a group. So if you have a large number of hosts in a cluster, they share a database. That's all a database really is. It's just a logical container. Forests are kind of the same thing, actually, but they're restricted to hosts. And then, of course, you've got stands, which is where your data ends up living. There's two different types of stands. You've got in-memory stands, and you have your on-disk stands. So documents live in stands. Stands begin life in memory. As transactions happen in MarkLogic server, these are recorded in the journal, and over time, items in the journal are then checkpointed to disk. The journal is used, obviously, for recovery. If the server's operating on an in-memory stand at the point where there's an outage, anything that's in the journal can then be replayed into stands. The journals are also used for replication. So anything that's in the journal is, if you like, the minimum amount of information for that fragment to be recreated in an in-memory stand. It doesn't contain index information, it just contains the data. The reason we don't store index information in the journals is because the server can generate those index settings themselves, or the index entries themselves. So it does make the journal quite compact. Obviously, the in-memory stand and the on-disk stand contains everything. So they'll be much larger than the artifact that's in the journal, depending on what your settings are for that database. So stands are eventually a collection of files on disk, and these live in forests. Forests are members of databases, and databases are shared across all hosts in the cluster. And forests, of course, are unique to, or are stored on a host or managed by a host. In-memory stands are short-lived. If a cluster's busy, they'll probably only last for seconds before they're flushed to disk. They are, at this point, they're updatable and queryable. As soon as something's in an in-memory stand, you should be able to query the data that's in there. I thought I'd put this on this slide as well. The difference between in-memory and on-disk stands is we don't modify on-disk stands once they've been flushed to disk. Everything that happens after that will go into in-memory stands, which are eventually merged back with the stands that are on disk. And as I've said here before, I think I've touched upon this briefly already, document updates are journaled for recovery purposes. So, as I say, we use this for replication, but we also use this for managing updates and recovering from outages or scenarios where a server goes offline, process goes offline. Okay, so we've talked about debug level messages. We've talked about setting debug level logging. The first thing to know, obviously, is debug level messages are informational. If you see a lot of debug level messages, things like this, for example, in-memory tree full, it's not a problem. It's just an informational message to let you know that your in-memory stand is full and it's going to be flushed to disk. So in this case, you can see in yellow, we've got list and tree. If you like, the way I try to think of dividing these up is the list is the universal index information, and the tree itself are the tree structures of the data. So the list can be recreated very easily by MarkLogic. The tree is your data that obviously can't be if there's a problem. If you have a corrupt stand and the list data is damaged, that can be easily regenerated. For trees, it's a different story. This gives you an indication on this particular line from the ErrorLog that the tree filled before the list. So you can see here the tree is 100%, and the list table is only 19%. In most cases, the defaults that the product ships with, if you've configured the server with the same amount of RAM that you've got when you're running, leave the defaults as they are. They're pretty good. In most cases, you won't ever want to tune these. You're probably not. If your only problem is worrying about tuning these, you don't have a problem with your cluster, I think is probably the best way I can put it. So in addition to the debug level messages, you'll also see info level messages, so a bit higher up, that show you that stands are being written to disk. And here you can see a stand isn't, hopefully you can see it's an incrementing number over time. So in this case, the first stand has been written to the documents forest. So you can probably gather that this was a brand new or an empty documents database when this was written. You'll see here a debug level message after the info message to show you that the stand has been written to disk. So this is the full life cycle, if you like, of data going from an in-memory stand to an on-disk stand. At some point, you'll see the in-memory full. In this case, it's the tree full message. And then from there, you'll see the stand gets created and it's written to disk, and it's now a file on disk. And yeah, I mentioned it before, on-disk stands don't change once they're on disk. New stands are added and then merges clean the information about deleted fragments and changes out. Okay, so telling you that you can't tune it if you did want to, all of these are tuned at the database level, so each database has its own settings. And if you look through the database configuration, this is the panel that basically manages all of these. In most cases, the only time you'd really want to change this is if you add more RAM to your host at any one point. But in most cases, the defaults are pretty good. The server will calculate these values, and generally they work pretty well. I've not seen any situation where someone's needed to tune these for performance. If you are going to tune them, this is kind of a cautionary tale. If you are going to start tuning your stand sizes, one of the things to watch out for is make sure your in-memory stands are big enough to make sure that the document can fit inside them. Otherwise, you'll get an XDMP frag too large message. There's a number of reasons why you might get this error. But in most cases, it's good practice to make sure your stands are larger than the data you're trying to store in them. Hopefully that's obvious. Okay, so the next scenario, this is a situation where the database would be unavailable. This is a slightly more severe scenario. In this case, you've got too many stands. So we're going to cover a few basic concepts with this. We're going to look at merges. We're going to look at the notion of an obsolete stand and obsolete stands. We're going to look at stand limits, and we're going to look at mounts as forests get remounted. Now, the first thing to mention, because this does come up from time to time, merging is necessary. Merging does eat quite a lot of your I/O. So there have been situations where people, when the server's busy, they'll turn off merging. It's a really, really bad idea. I'd recommend you don't do it. If your disk I/O can't keep up, oh, thank you. If your disk I/O can't keep up, there's probably a couple of things that you can do. First of all, slow down the rate of ingestion, or try and see if you can get faster disk somehow. Easier said than done, I know, but try not to make too many changes to merge policy. We do allow you to create blackouts on them, but it's not necessarily the best idea. Main reason being, the less stands you have, the better your query performance is. And merging is an ongoing housekeeping process for MarkLogic. One thing that we recommend is try and make sure you're getting 20 megabytes per second for your biggest merges. Now note here, again, hopefully I've made these big enough here. You can see here you've got merging messages logged at info level, 778 meg and 730 meg. If these are really small merges, you probably don't really care about the speed because they're not going to be very accurate. So if you're going to try and work out your average merge rates, don't look at small merges, look at the big ones. And you can see here that this merge on the bottom here happened at 10 megabytes per second. So ideally.
What is a big merge?
Oh, I mean, it's sort of anything that's not a couple of meg, for example, just to get an idea of a good. So over 20 meg, for example. Yeah, I mean, in this case, 700 meg's a decent size, gigabytes and so on. Yeah, I mean, primarily here you're looking at over 20 meg per second, so you want to make sure that the calculation is going to be accurate. So yeah, the bigger the size, the better the indication as to whether you've got a real I/O issue or not.
Is the forest like locked, so you can't read from anything like that while it's doing merge?
No. So we'll cover that in a few more slides, actually, sort of later on in the presentation. But basically, stands are always read-only. So what's happening when you're merging is it's reading a number of stands together and it's writing a new stand at the same time. So, yeah.
Is there any kind of sort of upper limit where it's like if you're getting merges over this, you should be doing something to fix that, and if you are getting merges over this, what should we be doing to fix that?
So you're talking about sort of slow merge speeds at this point, or?
No, I'm talking about getting merges where it's like I'm merging 50 gigs.
That's fine, generally speaking. But there is one setting called max stand size, which we will cover later on, which is useful for that. In most cases, actually, from MarkLogic 7, there is a max merge size where it's set to 32768, which is 32 gig. We put that in for a number of reasons. It's not necessarily faster to have more stands, but what it does give you is, if you've worked with MarkLogic for a long time, we used to say you need 3x disk space. That used to kind of annoy customers, putting it as bluntly as possible. So one of the things we did was we added a max merge size to cap the size of stands. So from MarkLogic 7 onwards, if it's a new install, your database will already have a max merge size of 32 gig. I'd say leave that as it is again. In most cases, it's a pretty good setting. It will mean that as the data grows, you'll have more stands, but if the merging operations are decent, it's not going to be a problem. Yeah, and we'll get to the reason why shortly in a couple more slides. Stands cannot be removed, so this is about obsolete stands now. They cannot be removed if outstanding queries are still in flight. So remember what I said earlier on about stands being read-only. Everything in MarkLogic is happening at a timestamp. This is a concept called MVCC. So when you run a query at any point, you're getting a request timestamp. What we guarantee with the server, this is how we guarantee integrity, is for that moment in time, you're guaranteed to get a complete response back, irrespective of whether the data has changed after that. And the way we manage that is by saying, okay, at this point in time, your query is running. Therefore, for the length of that query, we will retain all of the information for that timestamp until your query has been serviced. After that, we can then start to get rid of stands that are now considered by the server to be obsolete. So if you've got a long-running query, you will have stands kept around for a little bit longer. Again, not necessarily a problem if merging is healthy. So if you're doing a query that isn't an update, it's always going to be running at a timestamp. Okay, so this gets to the real problem, finally. There is a limit to the number of stands that you can have per forest. You will start seeing these messages. You can see one on the right-hand side. They will get more and more aggressive as time goes on. I think we have about 5 different thresholds for when they start to sort of increase in severity. And when I say increase in severity, I'm talking really about the log level. So in this case, it's getting to warning now. It's, we're not messing about. You need to deal with the fact that you're at 92% of your stand limit. Earlier on in the process, you'll get warning, not so much warning messages. You might get info or notice level messages to let you know that you're further away, but you're still hitting something of a stand limit. And then, of course, that.
Sorry, do you expect to be monitoring the logs for this kind of stuff?
Absolutely.
Is there anything you can use in the REST API that you can work out the values instead?
I don't think there is, no. There probably should be, but I suppose you could get a forest status and you could count the number of stands. So the REST API would give you the forest status and the number of stands, so you could total them. That would probably give you it. But all of these things are just in the logs, and as I say, it does get more and more aggressive. So for a laugh, if you want to disable merging and start inserting data, you'll start seeing these messages pile up.
Do you provide some kind of database on regular expressions for analyzing the log files?
We use grep, to be honest.
Yeah.
In most cases, that's kind of
Which is
yeah.
able to use regular expressions.
Yeah, so I've kind of got, on GitHub, I've got a load of gists that I've put together just to pull bits of information out of logs, but that's kind of the most high-tech we get is just, pulling these out of customer files.
You don't have to use high-tech if there is a simple solution.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm just wondering, there's so much best practice in your talk that I just wonder whether this is already collected for the customer, so that I don't have to figure it out again. So just use your database of grep statements and connect them to alarms with a framework we are using for supervision of the technology, of the hardware, of the IT infrastructure. So we have, I don't remember the framework. This is based on Perl. It's able to log in and to check things and could do similar things, and it would be appreciated to get the list of grep statements with according action for the administration stuff.
Yeah.
If you see this message, then you should do this. So some rules.
That's a great point. We don't have anything like that right now. There are some knowledge base articles, which I'll cover, that give you some of that information, but there isn't a tool yet. I don't know too much about MarkLogic 9, honestly. Support are always a bit behind the times with these things, but there is Ops Director in MarkLogic 9, and I believe in some of the features they're trying to assist with exactly that in MarkLogic 9. But again, probably people in this room now know more than I do if you've been to talks today. So I'm not entirely aware of to what extent. What I do know is a lot of customers use tools that aggregate a lot of this. So things like Logstash, for example, and Splunk.
That pushes metric information to CloudLogic and the operating systems. So that's one way of looking at logs, but actually looking at them is you get Logstash as forward occurrences of that message, for example. Yeah. It has rock rules, which are very similar to regex, blenders, regex against externals, which allows you to recognize patterns. So that CloudLogic will make alarms phrase, which is even more interesting.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Yeah, if you're using AWS, it's a completely different ballgame because they've already designed all of that at OS level. So you have more metrics than you could ever look at, I think, in AWS. Or you've certainly got a great deal of information that they provide for you. And as you said, there are alarms and everything else. So I think that does make a bit of a difference. I'm not really talking too much about deployment strategies in this particular talk. It's more about what you see in the file. But certainly, yeah, if you're using AWS, AWS will probably warn you way before MarkLogic does with a lot of problems. Not all. I think for stand limits, it probably wouldn't because it's kind of MarkLogic specific. But certainly for things like disk space, I would imagine for CPU utilization, CloudWatch is a perfect solution for that kind of thing. So yeah, the stand limit is 64. So if you start to encounter issues with I/O, so you've got a lot of ingestion happening. Remember the scenario we're talking about here is there's a lot of ingestion. As you get closer to the 64 stand limit, you'll start seeing more and more passive-aggressive and then aggressive messages in the logs from MarkLogic server, and it's warning you that you're getting closer to the 64 stand limit. Remember also that if you have long-running queries, the stands will have to stay around until that query is completed, and also, obviously, because we don't update the stands on disk, we create new ones. If merging starts to fall behind, you can get to points where you start hitting stand limits. this is pretty bad. After 64 stands, the forest will go offline, so you're basically down to painful recovery. You can recover from this, but there will be something of an outage. So it should be something that can be avoided fairly easily if you know what your environment's going to do. Generally, when we see this, it's usually a problem with I/O, almost always.
Is it notified before reaching 64?
Yeah, so the ErrorLog will spew out tons of these messages. I mean, this one's a 92% one, but you'll have been getting these for quite a long time before that. As I say, it's not something that's that common, but it is something that we've seen a few customers hit if there's problems. So if merges aren't allowed to complete, that's usually another example where it's been kind of inflicted, if you like.
Switch off merging.
Yeah, you can disable merging if you want to kind of make data load faster, for example, but the problem with that is without the cleanup, you can hit limits. So if you are going to do things like disable merging, remember there's a stand limit, so, you know, kind of be careful with it. Recovery is, as I say, it's not a problem for the data you can get back from it, but it does take a bit of time, so there could be an outage as a result. This kind of goes back to the question you asked earlier on. One of the things we did to control the size of merges was to introduce a merge max size, which caps the size of the stands. So what this means is because merges are going to be a bit smaller than they would have been before, I guess it's possible that you've got more smaller merges taking place rather than one for a very large stand that could be 200 gig in size. So it is a bit of a trade-off, because if you had just one stand, your queries would be faster, but the difference is negligible. If you've got a few, 5, 10 maybe stands per forest, it's never ever going to be an issue. Obviously, as you get closer to 64, things will really start to slow down, particularly if the system is overwhelmed at the time anyway. This is all part of the merge policy for the database. There are other settings there. I wouldn't recommend changing them. In fact, to be honest with you, stick with the defaults as much as possible.
So does that setting now get rid of the 3 times disk size?
Yeah.
So it's 1.5.
That's it. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, so the main reason that we brought that in was to get away from 3x, so that you should need 1.5. Obviously, as you can probably see, you need a certain amount of disk space anyway, because that rule's only going to kick in over a certain size because the stands are 32 gig. But yeah, before, does everyone know why we had a 3x rule, just out of interest? So the idea is, if you've got a very large stand, and remember in earlier versions of MarkLogic, by default, it would coalesce all of your data down to a single stand. You could also have potentially index changes going on, and you could also then have merges going on. So a merge could be writing the set of data again, and a reindex could be writing the same set of data again. It's a hypothetical scenario, but the safest overhead was always to say you'd need 3x disk space. Now we say 1.5x because of this merge max size. And as I say, that's been a default for MarkLogic 7. So a lot of these issues, in a sense, we haven't seen as much of since then, because they're...
So 1.5 available?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a little formula somewhere in support to do that. Is that you don't need to run that formula to figure out what to put in there?
All I'd say is probably look at the monitoring tools on port 8000, and that gives you an idea of how much free disk space you've got and how close you are to hitting the saturation point. But in most cases, again, just look at disk free and then look at the size of the directories on disk.
Yeah, but it's also hard to recover a node which is full if you
Yeah.
have HDS or some network storage. So if you use hard disk, then
Yeah.
you can't increase easily the hard disk space.
Yeah, that's actually a conversation I dread when you're telling people to try and get more disk allocated to their network attached storage in the middle of a crisis. It's like, yeah, we can't. You've run out of disk space. Sorry. It may be a magic product, but It's not that magic. Yeah, if you run out of disk space, you're screwed. It's quite simple. And I think this is a rule for most databases. Bear in mind, I've never worked for another database company, but I'm pretty sure if you run out of disk space, even with any of our largest competitors, you probably won't get very far up to a certain point. So yeah, disk space is just, and honestly, there are so many customers that hit it, it really should be avoidable.
So you can, add a new cluster, host to the cluster, then it's
Yeah.
rebalancing.
Exactly. So yeah, the ideal way of doing it is continue to add nodes, continue to add forests, and so on. And hopefully, if you've got, if you're adding more nodes, you're adding disk provisioning for it as well. Obviously, there are other things. If you turn on a whole load of indexes on a massive database and you haven't pre-calculated the growth size, there could be situations where you find you get close to limits. But hopefully, you've tested all of that in a development environment first before you put it live over a weekend. Yeah, when hardly anyone else is around. Yeah.
Information is obviously being pulled from somewhere by MarkLogic.
Yeah, OS.
Is there a way of accessing that functionality within MarkLogic to file what we will learn to me and my colleagues? So
Yeah.
it's going to end up feed up.
Yeah, it's one of the XDMP built-ins, I think, tells you. There's one of the status built-ins. I can't remember which one. I want to say it's host status, but I don't think it is. But yeah, one of the 15 minutes. Oh gosh, okay. Yeah, it's one of the XDMP built-ins will tell you how much disk space you've got. Also, if you're being, yeah, I think so. And if you generate a support dump as well, it's definitely in there. So you can search for it in there otherwise. But yeah, you can get it in. You can get that value in Xquery. Yeah, I mean, MarkLogic will send, if you want, MarkLogic will send emails, so you can use a call to XDMP email, check the value, email nice and easy. Just a thought. I mean, simple solutions, but there are obviously a bunch of other tools that people use in industry to allow them to do that. Things like Logly and Logstash and so on.
Some forest property for the host, because forests are on disks and not on host.
Sorry?
The gentleman asked for the property to see how full disks are.
Yeah.
Isn't that a forest property?
It could be, yeah. It might be XDMP forest status. I can't remember which. It's definitely in the support dump. One of the status built-ins will tell you. If it's not host, it's forest or, yeah. Yeah, I think the REST API will give you that information as well. If you comb through all of the different settings, I can't remember offhand, but it's definitely in there because I've pulled that value out a number of times before. And generally, that's one of the things we look for as well if we're looking at support dumps. Okay. So we've talked about this quite a bit now. When you do hit problems with disk space, you'll see messages like this: XDMP merge space, and it's not merging due to disk space limitations. In this case, you can see it needs quite a lot more disk space than it has. The server will keep working, but remember at this point it's not going to be able to complete merging, so the number of stands you've got will grow, queries will start to slow down, it will eventually cause you bigger problems. So yeah, recovery, I hate to say it, but either reclaim disk space or add more, stop ingesting data for a bit, get the system stable, add more disk space if you can.
It might be a good idea to save a big file and to being able to delete it and then to make some magic.
Exactly. Exactly. A common one is not have, if you've got a problem with disk space, don't back up to the same line. Keep 5 days worth of backups. Yeah, as I say, things aren't as bad as they were when we had the 3x rule, but yeah, obviously disk space is a premium in all cases. And the other thing is obviously the more indexes and the more range indexes you create, the bigger your stands are. If you want to make really big stands, turn on 1-character indexes and then start storing binary data in there. So yeah, the next one is a scenario where queries fail with a new stamp, XDMP new stamp. For this one, we'll cover a few different scenarios, but the main one, we talked about this a bit already, a few different concepts. The main one is MVCC, multi-version concurrency control. So everything in MarkLogic is time-related. It's essentially a very time-based system. You've got a couple of different settings, contemporaneous and non-blocking MVCC. By default, we're set to contemporaneous. What we'll do in this situation is we'll wait for a commit to become available. What MVCC will try to do, or contemporaneous MVCC will try to do, is it will get the latest known timestamp to run your query at. So it's kind of trying to pick the latest point possible for that host to service a query. But obviously, if the queries are still, if there are other updates that are in flight at that point, they're going to have to wait for the timestamp to become available and free from commits beforehand, because there's obviously a queue behind it. We're not going to return a query at a late timestamp if there's transactions in an earlier timestamp taking place elsewhere. So contemporaneous is the default. Non-blocking, I suppose this is kind of more like the eventual consistency. You're not going to get the most up-to-date information, but you're going to get the lowest timestamp known that all forests agree is the safest timestamp to run the query from. So that's a very brief introduction to multi-version concurrency control, remembering that every query happens at a timestamp, and at any one point, each of your forests in the cluster will be maintaining different timestamps. So the node that's evaluating the query has to figure out what the best timestamp to use is for the query, and those are the two settings that you can configure. So in a situation where there are a large number of transactions happening, and you've got a late timestamp that you're trying to run your query at, if a timeout happens, you'll see this message, XDMP new stamp. Now, generally speaking, hopefully your code will retry that query, but also if you start seeing this a lot, it probably does mean that you're resource bound, because if the queries are taking that long to complete, because you've got a backlog of other timestamps finishing their transactions, it probably means the system could be swapping or just taking a very, very long time to process. So you might want to look at what else is going on that could be causing that. I think we're getting fairly close to the end now. I'll see if I can get through this scenario, but again, if you've got any questions, please feel free to run those through by me. XDMP cache full errors. These are really common from a development point of view. So for this slide, we're going to introduce the three caches, the three main group level caches. So you've got the expanded tree, compressed tree, and list cache. Now, if you think back to the earlier slide where we talked about list data and tree data, the compressed tree and list cache basically store those two pieces of data. List cache is everything that's in the universal index, and then the compressed tree is your data. Expanded tree is what the enode uses to respond. So when you run a query, the compressed data is taken from the dnode, the part that's servicing the data section of the request, and it's turning it into XML or JSON, and then storing it in the expanded tree cache for a very, very fast return. So yeah, okay, I've kind of jumped ahead with what's on this slide here. So yeah, list cache is list data, compressed tree cache is tree data. These are monitored through hit and miss ratios. Under a good scenario, hopefully you're going to be seeing a much higher proportion of hits over misses. Whenever you've got a miss, it's got to go and read from disk. So the more you can hit the cache, the faster your query responses are going to be, pretty much in all cases. These ratios are calculated, I think, over the last minute, so they're updated fairly frequently. Ideally, in a fairly healthy system, yeah, you should be seeing a much higher proportion of hits over misses. So that's one thing to look out for if you're starting to see performance problems. If you start seeing expanded tree cache full errors like this when you're generating queries, the chances are it's probably because you're trying to load a lot of fragments back from disk, and there's not enough expanded tree cache available to service the request. So the obvious one is if you're running a query that's a search that may be returning 1 million fragments, and all of those need to be expanded in the cache first of all, and the cache runs out of space, you might want to look at rewriting that query. If you need 1 million fragments, then you might have to think of more creative ways of managing, but in most cases, you can probably chunk the results so you don't fill the cache in one go. The other thing to bear in mind is you don't always need to grab the whole document, so you might want to just go and get URIs back. That's why we've got things like the URI lexicons and range indexes and so on. So it's quite a common problem, but again, usually can be worked around. You don't always need to fill the cache in order to service a query. You can obviously expand the expanded tree cache itself, and also note that all of our caches by default are partitioned as well. So we set them up into silos, if you like, so concurrent queries can service requests at any point. Decreasing the partition size could be a workaround, but it's probably best to go back and rework the query at any point, at some point rather. Ensuring fragments are small is also a good idea. MarkLogic works really well with documents that are around a meg in size. If you're working with huge documents, you're probably going to find very quickly that breaking them up will give you much better performance. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I can try and go through this scenario, or you can ask me any questions if you want. Okay, host drops out in the cluster. For this, we talked about this briefly earlier on, XDQP. We're going to talk about heartbeat packets. We're going to talk about quorum, synchronizing clocks, and of course, the effect it can have on availability. So XDQP is an internal TCP protocol. Each of the hosts in the cluster are sending around every second heartbeat information. Now remember, we were talking about timestamps earlier on. Every forest has a timestamp, and each of the hosts propagates that information through the timestamp packet. So every second, your cluster is interchanging all of the timestamp information for each of the hosts. I think it aggregates and gets the latest one, so it's not sending them all over, it's sending the most recent for the forests on that host. This system is also used for making sure that the cluster's healthy. As these heartbeat packets are sent around, if there is a situation where one of the hosts doesn't respond, failover will happen, as long as most of the hosts in the cluster agree. We go for 50% quorum. So in a cluster of 3 nodes, you need 2 nodes to vote 1 off, obviously, because anything less than that, you don't have 50% quorum, or over 50% quorum. XDQP timeout is the error that the exception you'll see if it thinks that a host is unavailable. If you get one of those, it's not necessarily a problem. Multiple ones of those, failover will kick in if you have a 3-node cluster. So if you start seeing things like this, it's a debug level message, but it might be indicating that there's some kind of network issue lower down. So in this case, you know it's XDQP, so you know it's a communication issue between hosts. And in this case, a query can't be completed because one of the hosts participating in that query, and remember, queries are distributed across all the hosts that have forests for that query, this one isn't responding. So the query is going to be delayed until this host responds over XDQP. In this case, the session's lost. Could be a network issue. You may also, alongside these, start to see hung messages. At first, they'll be debug level, and then as things get a bit more severe, they'll probably turn into warning level messages. If it gets to the point where it gets longer than the XDQP timeout, obviously failover will happen, and the host will be dropped from the cluster at that point. What could cause hung messages? Heavily loaded system. Resource availability, mostly I/O bandwidth is usually the problem. CPU and RAM generally don't cause you to have hung messages. I suppose if you're running a very, very complex query, you might see a hung message because of CPU activity, but almost always it's I/O weight that causes the problem. The triggers for this could be a large batch of merges, very, very long-running, heavy, intensive queries, and long hung messages could result in HA failover, which will cause even more performance issues as failover takes place. Some of the things you can use for mitigating this is you can increase the XDQP timeout settings. I think it's 10 seconds by default. In a lot of cases, if the cluster is probably more than, say, 5 nodes, you probably want to increase that at least to 20. In a lot of the cases, we recommend 30 now as well. This doesn't really buy you much other than it kind of ensures that the XDQP messages have longer to propagate around the hosts. But in a bigger cluster, that can take more time, particularly if things are busy. Try and distribute your data evenly across forests as well, obviously. If one host has a lot more forest, it's going to be doing a great deal more work for that particular query. Another issue that you might see is clock skew. Generally speaking, if you're not using NTP on your cluster, you really should. In most cases, this is just a warning message, but it could also be the indication that something's going wrong. It could indicate that there's a load issue. So clock skew can happen just because the clocks get out of sync between each of the hosts in the cluster. It could also happen because there's a problem with the host actually keeping up to the point where it's not keeping time anymore. And as soon as the time gets out of sync, it can cause problems. Not always a problem, might be an indicator of a system under load. However, again, it can cause the host to get kicked out of the cluster if it's a big problem. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, MarkLogic is so kind of time sensitive, I think is probably the best way I can describe it.
Just go quickly back to the large merges being a possible trigger for XDQP no session. When you said tune the merge settings, but is that more advanced than just dropping the size of the max merges?
Yeah, so the merge max size is the kind of the safest one to tune. You've got things like merge ratios on that page as well, which kind of govern how aggressively merges take place. So,
is that the sort of thing where if we see that, we would want to be talking to you guys and saying, can you recommend some settings for us to provide?
I'd strongly recommend opening a case first in most cases. So 32768 is the standard. We have told, in some scenarios, we've told customers to increase that number. I think 48 gig and 64 gig have been recommended for different scenarios, but generally speaking, 32 gig is pretty good, certainly from 7 onwards. I wouldn't recommend changing it if you're still running 6. I just kind of leave it set to 0. Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you haven't changed it, or if you've upgraded from an earlier release, it might still be 0. But in most cases, if it's a new database built on 7, it should be 32 gig already. In most of these cases, seriously, the defaults are pretty good. It's generally a case of if you want to eke out a bit of performance, there are possibly other options. But yeah, definitely worth opening a case with us.
What we're seeing is sometimes we'll see like spikes where our response time jumps from sort of a couple of hundred milliseconds up to like 4 or 5 seconds for a short period of time, and that always seems to be when a large merge operation of like 50 gig or so is happening.
Interesting, and this is on 7.
This is on 7.
What version?
704, because we tried to go to 705, and it seems to be that that's when you change the XDQP protocol, so you can't go from 704 to anything above 704.
Right.
And still have to replicate off the same master.
Yeah, this is. I'm really glad you've mentioned this. This is an issue that people have been discussing. We've had a few other customers talk about this. So it's an issue with merging, essentially, and I/O response time spikes. We've not been able to recreate it, but we've added quite a lot of instrumentation into later releases of 7 that give us metrics to try and figure out what's going on. We've got a few ongoing issues in that area that are being looked into by engineering. If you're upgrading to 8, it doesn't seem to be a problem, but it is a problem with 7 right now. We're getting pretty close to understanding it, but it's an ongoing issue, and it sounds like you're hitting that particular problem.
Is that the sort of thing where there might actually be new releases of 7
Yeah.
to wait it out?
In fact, we've got a hotfix that we're working on now that's got the next round.
That will be not just on the latest version of 7, which we can't go to because of XDQP issues.
Yeah, you'd need to upgrade. There's
If we're
no.
going to have to do a green-blue swap to get to
Right.
the new XDQP version, we might as well just go all the way to 8.
Right, yeah. In that case, it's probably not going to be useful to know. But yeah, there's a whole load of metrics that are in the latest releases of 7 that try and address that particular issue that you're seeing. It's not something that we ever saw in QA, interestingly. Only a small handful of customers seem to have seen it. But it's always been with 7. In every case we've seen it, it's been with 7. But yeah, open a case with us as well. time's up, apparently. I'm happy to answer questions if you're happy to ask them. On the other hand, you know, I'm standing between you and a cocktail party at this point, so you know, feel free to go and grab drinks if you want. But if you want to pummel me with questions, also, I'm more than happy to.
The slides were provided.
Sorry?
The slides were provided.
I think they're probably available to download. Yeah, I would imagine so. If not, I'm happy to give you a copy of the slide deck.
So 2015 is certainly up and available to get, so I assume 2016 will go up as soon as on the MarkLogic website.
Yeah, I'd have thought so. Yeah, I mean, it's not something I'm handling, but yeah, I would imagine that they'll all be available for download. I mean, I think these are a lot of these sessions are recorded as well. So for those that would want to, ever watch this again. But yeah, the slide deck should be available. If there's an issue, though, you just send me an email and I'll make sure I send it out to you. All right, thanks, guys.